Alright, we're going to take a look at the emergence of rock and roll. Where did rock and roll come from? Well, there are two key events that led to the explosion of rock and roll. The first was the blurring of lines between music forms. Up until when rock and roll started, there were three very separate music forms. There was pop music, like Frank Sinatra, Perry Como. There was rhythm and blues, like Muddy Waters. And then there was country and western with artists like Hank Williams Sr. And they had been very separate. But then something changed, and that was the emergence of a distinct teen culture. What had happened is teens really didn't have a strong identity that was separate from their parents up until the 1950s. This was due to factors like the Great Depression and World War II, but things changed after that point, getting into the 1950s. So let's take a closer look at both of these. We're going to start with the fact that the lines between pop, rock and R&B, rhythm and blues, and country and western started blurring. This happened primarily in the period of 1954 to 1956. So in the early 1950s, some R&B hits also became modest pop hits that they started selling to the pop audience. And so big record companies saw a financial opportunity that they could make money by doing this. But what they needed to do is make their own versions of the R&B song, something that was a little bit less rough that the pop audience would be able to relate to and want to buy. Now, looking at the emergence of the distinct teen culture, the youth began to have their own money. Financial times were finally getting better after a long period of being very poor, again, as we entered into the 1950s. And so the youth began to have their own identity through things like their own movies, especially the movies of James Dean. They had their own clothing, they had their own hairstyles, and they had their own slang, their way of talking that really separated them from their parents' generation. But what they needed was their own music. They didn't want to listen to the boring pop music that their parents were listening to. So we got our first true rock and roll star. It was Bill Haley and the Comets. Their big hit was Rock Around the Clock. Their music was popular with pop audiences, R&B audiences, and country and western audiences. And this was something that was really new. But there was a problem. Bill Haley just wasn't rebellious enough. He was older and he just didn't have that rebellious appeal that someone like James Dean did. So, the solution to this problem was this very handsome young man from Tupelo, Mississippi. And in case you don't know who this is, it is Elvis Presley. Elvis was especially well suited to take rock and roll from what very much could have been just a fad into a true music form. And this is because as a child he was exposed to a real large variety of music forms. So he had the ability to create music that had a crossover appeal to a large variety of audiences. His big breakout year was 1956, and from there rock and roll really took off.